Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
Growing up, I always knew that my brother Ethan was the favorite, but I never expected it to follow us into adulthood. Never thought that our parents would make decisions that would change my life without even considering how it might affect me. It was always clear, even when we were kids, that Ethan could do no wrong, that his mistakes were brushed aside while mine were held over my head, that his wants were treated as needs while mine were treated as unnecessary burdens. If he forgot his homework, our mother would drive it to school, telling him how special and smart he was, but if I forgot mine, I was scolded for being irresponsible and forced to deal with the consequences. If he wanted new shoes because his old ones were boring, they would take him to the mall that very weekend. But when I asked for new shoes because mine had actual holes in them, I was told that money didn't grow on trees. I told myself it didn't matter. I worked hard, built my own path, became independent in ways Ethan never had to. While he coasted through life knowing that someone would always be there to clean up his messes, I learned how to stand on my own 2 feet, learned how to survive without expecting anything from them, learned how to be okay with the fact that I would always be second in their eyes. And for a while, I thought I had made peace with it, thought I had accepted the fact that no matter what I did, no matter how much I accomplished, I would never be Ethan. But then, they sold my childhood home, and that was the moment I realized just how little I really meant to them. It happened without warning, without so much as a phone call, without even the courtesy of telling me before I found out from a third party. One afternoon, I was scrolling through my phone, absent-mindedly checking emails and notifications, when a message popped up from an old neighbor, someone who had lived down the street from us since I was a kid, someone who had known our family for years. "Hey, I just saw the for sale sign in your front yard. Are your parents moving? Hope everything's okay." For a second, I thought it had to be a mistake, thought maybe they had meant to text someone else, thought that there was no way my parents had put our house on the market without telling me. But the more I stared at the message, the more I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach, a gnawing sense of unease that told me this wasn't a misunderstanding, that something was very, very wrong. I called my mother immediately, my hands shaking as I waited for her to pick up, my mind racing with 1,000 questions, with a growing anger that I was barely able to contain. When she finally answered, her voice was casual, like nothing was out of the ordinary, like she wasn't hiding the fact that she had just erased the one place that had ever felt like home to me. "Hey, sweetheart," she said, as if nothing was wrong, as if I wasn't about to demand answers that she should have given me without hesitation. "What's going on?" I didn't bother with pleasantries, didn't try to ease into the conversation, didn't even try to pretend that I wasn't furious. "Are you selling the house?" I asked, my voice sharp, my breath coming quicker than I wanted it to, my chest tightening as I waited for her answer. There was a pause, just long enough for me to know that she had been hoping I wouldn't find out, that she had been hoping I would just accept it once it was too late to do anything about it. And then, with an almost bored sigh, she said, "Oh, that. Yes, we decided it was time to move on. Move on." As if that house hadn't been the one constant in my life. As if it hadn't been the place where every childhood memory was rooted. As if it hadn't been the home I had always assumed would be there for us no matter what. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice tight, my hands clenched into fists, my heart pounding in my ears. Another pause, another sigh, and then the words that would change everything. "Ethan needed it more than you." For a moment, I thought I had misheard, thought that there was no possible way she had just said what I thought she had. "What?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, my grip tightening around my phone as I tried to process what was happening. "We wanted to help Ethan," she said, as if that was a reasonable explanation, as if that justified selling my childhood home out from under me. "His wedding is coming up, and well, it's expensive. A good venue, the catering, the honeymoon. It all adds up, and we wanted to give him the wedding he deserves." I felt like I had been punched in the stomach, like the air had been sucked out of my lungs, like the foundation of everything I had ever known had just been ripped out from under me. They had sold our house. Not because they needed the money. Not because it was too much for them to maintain. Not because it was time to downsize. They had sold our house to pay for my brother's wedding. My childhood memories, my connection to the past, the one place that had ever felt like home, all of it was gone. Also, Ethan could have a luxury venue, a designer tuxedo, and a honeymoon that would last 2 weeks at most. And when I confronted them, when I demanded to know how they could do this, when I asked them if they even thought about how this would affect me, my mother simply laughed. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she said, dismissing me like she always had, brushing aside my feelings like they were nothing more than an inconvenience. "You don't need the house, Jack. You're doing fine on your own, aren't you? You're always so independent." But Ethan, he needs us. You have to understand. Understand? Understand that I would always come second? Understand that no matter how hard I worked, no matter what I achieved, I would never be seen as worthy the way Ethan was? Understand that they had never, not once, considered what this would mean for me? I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to breathe, forcing myself to swallow the rage that was threatening to spill over, forcing myself to accept what I had always known deep down, but had never wanted to admit. I would never come first. Not to them. Not in this family. And that was the moment I made a promise to myself. I would never let them use me the way they used that house. Because one day, they would come to me. One day, they would need me. And when that day came, I would remember exactly how they treated me. Years passed, and I did exactly what my parents always expected me to do. I survived on my own, built my own life, carved out a future without their help, without their support, without a single ounce of the love and generosity they had showered on Ethan without hesitation. I worked my way up in my career, learned how to manage my finances, figured out how to be independent in ways they had never taught me, in ways I had been forced to learn while Ethan was given everything on a silver platter. I struggled at times, but I made it through, and despite how much it hurt, despite how much their betrayal had cut me deep, I told myself that I was better off without them. And Ethan? Well, Ethan lived exactly the way you'd expect someone to live when they had never been told no a single day in their life. He burned through money faster than he could make it, jumped from one failed business idea to the next, spent recklessly on vacations, on luxury cars, on expensive clothes, on every superficial indulgence he could get his hands on. His marriage, the one my parents had sold our childhood home to fund, lasted all of 3 years before his wife realized exactly what kind of man she had married. A spoiled, entitled, useless little boy masquerading as an adult. She left him with nothing, taking whatever assets she could legally claim, and Ethan, for the first time in his life, was forced to deal with the consequences of his own decisions. But unlike me, he had no idea how to survive on his own. And my parents? They had built their entire future around the idea that Ethan would take care of them one day, that after everything they had given him, after everything they had sacrificed for him, after all the times they had chosen him over me, he would eventually step up and return the favor. But that didn't happen, because when the money ran out, when my parents started struggling with their health, when the medical bills started piling up, when the reality of their terrible financial planning finally hit them, Ethan did what Ethan had always done. He disappeared. He made excuses, told them he was going through a rough time, promised he would help when he could, but he never actually followed through. He dodged their calls, ignored their messages, and when things got truly bad, when my mother was on the verge of losing what little savings she had left, when my father's medical bills became too overwhelming to ignore, when their comfortable life finally collapsed around them, they had no one left to turn to but me. The call came late one evening, just as I was finishing up some work, the name flashing across my phone screen like a ghost from the past. I stared at it for a long moment, debating whether I should even bother answering, debating whether I should just let it ring and pretend I hadn't seen it, debating whether I should let them finally experience what it felt like to be unimportant. But curiosity won. I picked up, keeping my voice neutral, emotionless, unwilling to let her hear even a hint of what I was feeling. "Mom," I said, short to the point, waiting for her to explain why, after all these years, after everything that had happened, she was suddenly calling me out of the blue. She didn't bother with small talk, didn't ask how I had been, didn't pretend that this was anything other than what it was, a desperate attempt to get something from me. "Jack," she said, and I could hear the strain in her voice, the way it wavered, the way it carried an unfamiliar weight, a kind of weakness I had never heard from her before. "We need your help." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, letting the silence stretch between us, letting her sit in her own discomfort for a moment before responding. "Do you?" I asked, my tone flat, unreadable. "Funny, I don't remember you needing my help when you sold our house to pay for Ethan's wedding. I don't remember you needing my help when you told me he deserved it more." She let out a shaky breath, and for a brief second, I thought she might actually acknowledge what she had done, might actually apologize. But she didn't. She did exactly what she had always done. She brushed it aside. "Oh, Jack, that was years ago," she said, her voice taking on that familiar dismissive tone, as if the past was something that could simply be erased with time, as if betrayal had an expiration date, as if I should have just moved on because it was inconvenient for her to acknowledge how deeply she had hurt me. "Things are different now. Your father isn't doing well, and we don't have anywhere else to go." "Ethan," she paused, her voice catching for just a second, just long enough to let me know that saying his name out loud physically hurt her. "Ethan isn't in a position to help us right now." I nearly laughed at that, nearly let out the bitter, cruel sound bubbling up in my chest, nearly threw it back in her face, nearly told her that she should have seen this coming, that she should have known Ethan would never be the kind of person to step up when things got hard, that she had chosen the wrong son, that she had bet everything on the wrong horse. But I didn't, because I wasn't the same person I had been all those years ago. I was smarter now, colder now. I knew how to play the long game. I knew how to make them feel the weight of their choices. So instead, I kept my voice calm, kept my words carefully measured, kept my tone just soft enough to give her the illusion of hope. So, what exactly are you asking me to do, Mom? There was another pause, another hesitation, another moment where I could practically hear her pride cracking, hear the shame creeping into her voice, hear the quiet, devastating realization that she had nowhere else to turn. We need a place to stay, she admitted, barely above a whisper, as if saying it out loud made it real. Just for a little while, just until we get back on our feet. I let the silence drag out. Let her sit in the desperation. Let her wait for my answer the way I had waited for theirs when I begged them to reconsider selling the house. And then finally I spoke. I'll think about it, I said, keeping my tone light, casual, as if I wasn't already 2 steps ahead of them. Because my parents thought I would be the good, responsible child again, thought I would do what I had always done, thought I would set aside my own anger and clean up the mess they had made. But they had no idea. I wasn't going to make this easy for them, because this time I had other plans. I knew my parents well enough to predict exactly what they would do next, knew they wouldn't immediately accept that I was their only option, knew they would still hold on to some shred of hope that Ethan, their golden child, their beloved son, their greatest investment, would finally step up and take care of them the way they had always believed he would. They had spent their entire lives making excuses for him, bending over backward to shield him from consequences, throwing every available resource at his feet, while expecting me to fend for myself. And now, even after he had abandoned them, after he had ignored their calls, after he had made it painfully clear that he didn't care about their struggles, they still hadn't let go of the illusion. So I wasn't surprised when, just a few days after my mother's desperate phone call, I got another message from her, this time laced with an artificial sense of calm, as if she was trying to convince herself that things weren't as bad as they seemed. We talked to Ethan. He just needs some time. He's going through a lot right now. But he promised he'd help us soon. I smirked as I read it, shaking my head because I knew exactly what that meant. Ethan had blown them off. Maybe he had told them he was too busy. Maybe he had made some vague excuse about work. Maybe he had dodged the conversation entirely, telling them he'd figure something out when he had no real intention of doing so. Either way, my parents, desperate as they were still trying to spin the situation in a way that didn't force them to confront the ugly truth staring them in the face. I could have told them then. I could have responded with a simple, Ethan isn't going to help you. And you know it. I could have pointed out that this was exactly what they had chosen, that they had built their entire future around a man who had never done a single responsible thing in his entire life, that they had put all their faith into someone who would never put them first the way they had put him first. But I didn't, because I wanted them to realize it on their own. I wanted them to feel every second of disappointment, every pang of regret, every ounce of helplessness that came with understanding that the person they had sacrificed everything for had never actually cared about them. So I waited. And sure enough, the next time my mother called me, there was no more forced optimism in her voice. There was only panic. Jack, she said, and I could hear the way she was trying to keep her voice steady, could hear the way her breathing was uneven, could hear the way she was barely holding it together. Do you want to answer our calls anymore? I leaned back in my chair, letting the words settle, letting her sit in the weight of them, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her feel the discomfort of what she had just admitted. Is that so? I finally said, my voice calm, almost amused, as if I hadn't been expecting anything else. My mother let out a slow, shaky breath, the kind of breath that comes when someone has finally come to terms with the truth they've been avoiding. I don't understand, she whispered, and I could tell from the way her voice cracked that this wasn't just about Ethan ignoring their calls. This was about everything. After everything we did for him, after everything we gave up, after all the times we put him first, she trailed off, as if saying the words out loud made it hurt more, as if acknowledging the truth made it impossible to deny. And for the first time in my life, I heard real regret in my mother's voice. I let that sink in for a moment, let her feel the full weight of it, let her finally understand what I had understood all along. And then I said, guess he doesn't think he owes you anything, Mom. She made a small, choked noise, the kind of noise someone makes when they want to argue but don't have the strength to fight anymore, the kind of noise someone makes when they've run out of excuses. And then, After a long, excruciating pause, she broke. She started crying. Not the fake kind of crying she used to do when she wanted to manipulate someone, not the frustrated tears she shed when things didn't go her way, but real, broken sobs. The kind of crying that comes when you realize you've wasted your entire life believing in something that was never real. And I felt nothing. No satisfaction. No triumph. Just a cold, distant sense of inevitability. Because this was always going to happen. I knew Ethan better than they did. I knew he was selfish. Knew he would always put himself first. Knew that when it really came down to it, he didn't love them the way they had loved him. He had never loved them the way they had loved him. And now they finally saw it too. My mother sniffled, her breath shaky, and when she spoke again, her voice was different. Softer, more defeated, more desperate. "Jack," she whispered, and I knew what was coming next. "I know we haven't always treated you the way you deserved. I know we made mistakes. But please, sweetheart, we don't have anywhere else to go." She had never called me sweetheart before. Not once. Not when I was a child. Not when I was struggling. Not when I was begging them to see me, to choose me, to love me the way they loved Ethan. And now, suddenly, when she was at her lowest, when she had no one else to turn to, when the son she had given everything to had abandoned her completely, now, she wanted to act like I was her last hope. I let out a slow breath, rubbing my temple, pretending to be deep in thought, pretending to be considering something I had already decided long ago. And then, after a long pause, I said, "I'll think about it." Because my mother thought she was finally getting through to me. She thought she was pulling at my heartstrings. She thought she was breaking down my walls. But what she didn't know was that I had no intention of making this easy. Because I wasn't Ethan. I wasn't going to give them everything without making them feel the weight of what they had done. And whatever happened next, it was going to be on my terms. I had spent years wondering if my parents ever regretted the way they had treated me, wondering if, deep down, they ever felt guilty for making me second best in every possible way, wondering if they ever looked back on the choices they made and realized that they had sacrificed a son who actually cared for one who never did. But now, with nothing left, with Ethan gone, with their security shattered, with their backs against the wall, I wasn't about to take their words at face value. Regret and desperation can look a lot alike when someone has nowhere else to turn. I had no doubt that my mother's tears were real. No doubt that she was heartbroken over the way Ethan had abandoned them. No doubt that she was devastated that the life she had built around him had crumbled right before her eyes. But what I didn't know, what I needed to know, was whether she was actually sorry for how she had treated me, or if I was just the last person standing, the final lifeline she was reaching for now that all other options had failed. So I decided to test them. I wanted to see how far their regret actually went, wanted to see if they were willing to swallow their pride, wanted to see if they were truly remorseful, or if they were just expecting me to play the role of the good, responsible son yet again. I called my mother the next day, my voice careful, measured, giving her just enough hope to make her believe I was considering taking them in. I told her that after thinking about it, I was willing to offer them a place to stay, but it wouldn't be anything close to the life they were used to. I had a small guest house on my property, nothing fancy, nothing luxurious, nothing that would give them even a fraction of the comfort they had grown accustomed to over the years. It was a single-room space with an old couch that pulled out into a bed, a tiny kitchenette that could barely fit 2 people at once, and a bathroom that had plumbing problems I hadn't bothered to fix. It was a place to survive, not a place to live comfortably. And that was the point. If they were truly sorry, if they truly regretted the way they had treated me, if they truly saw me as their only hope, then they would take it without hesitation. Because beggars don't get to be choosers. At first, my mother was overwhelmingly grateful, gushing over the phone, thanking me repeatedly, telling me that it didn't matter where they stayed, that they were just happy I was giving them a chance. But I knew my mother, knew how easily she could manipulate, knew how quickly gratitude could turn into entitlement the second she got comfortable. And sure enough, within 2 days of moving in, the complaint started. "This couch is really uncomfortable, Jack," she said one evening, her voice laced with forced patience, the same tone she had always used when trying to convince me to do something without outright demanding it. "I don't suppose you have an extra bed somewhere?" I shrugged, keeping my voice casual, nonchalant, as if I hadn't been expecting her to ask. "No, that's all I've got. If you don't like it, you're welcome to find somewhere else." She hesitated, her lips pressing together, clearly struggling with the idea that she wasn't in a position to negotiate. A few days later, it was the plumbing. "Jack, the water pressure in the shower is awful," she said, standing in the doorway of my main house, looking every bit the woman who had spent her entire life believing she deserved better than what she had. I can barely rinse my hair. Could you at least call someone to take a look? I didn't even glance up from my phone. Feel free to call a plumber if you want, I said, keeping my voice light, unconcerned. But I'm not paying for it. She stared at me, like she couldn't quite believe I was serious, like she had actually convinced herself that I was going to cater to her needs after everything she had done. But the real moment, the real turning point, the moment that confirmed everything I already knew, came when I overheard my father late one night, sitting outside on the tiny porch of the guest house, grumbling to himself, as if he still had the right to be angry at the world. This wouldn't be happening if Ethan hadn't screwed us over, he muttered, his voice sharp, bitter, filled with resentment, but not towards himself, not towards my mother, not towards the choices that had led them here, towards me. And now we're stuck here like we're being punished for something. Punished. That was the word he used. Not getting what we deserve. Not facing the consequences of our own mistakes. Not finally seeing the reality of how we treated Jack. Punished. As if they were the victims in all of this. As if I was some cruel, heartless man who was making them suffer just for the fun of it. As if they still, even now, even after everything, believe that they deserve better than this. And that was when I knew. They weren't sorry. They weren't regretful. They weren't taking responsibility for what they had done. They were just desperate. They were still the same people they had always been, still the same entitled, selfish parents who had never once seen me as their priority, still the same people who had given Ethan everything while expecting me to survive on scraps. And the second they thought they had even the slightest bit of control over me again, the second they thought they could start pushing boundaries, the second they thought I might cave just a little, they immediately fell back into the same entitled, selfish mindset they had always had. But they were about to learn something very important. I wasn't their safety net. I wasn't their backup plan. And no matter how much they begged, no matter how much they pretended to be grateful, no matter how many fake apologies they tried to throw my way, I wasn't going to be their second choice anymore. Because now, they were about to experience exactly what it felt like to be unwanted. I had spent my whole life wondering why my parents had treated Ethan like a prince while I was left to scrape together whatever I could for myself. Why they had showered him with everything while expecting me to survive on my own. Why they had always made it clear that I was the afterthought. As a kid, I used to think maybe I had done something wrong, that maybe there was something about me that just wasn't enough for them, that maybe if I worked harder, if I was more obedient, if I got better grades, if I did everything they asked without complaint, they would finally see me, finally care about me, finally love me the way they loved him. But they never did. And after everything, after all the years of being pushed aside, after they had sold my childhood home to fund Ethan's wedding, after they had chosen him over me in every single way that mattered, I decided it was time to stop wondering. I wanted to hear the truth from their own mouths. I wanted them to say it out loud. So one evening, after another round of complaints from my mother about how small the guest house was, after another sigh from my father about how he never thought he'd be living like this, after another passive-aggressive remark about how Ethan should be the one taking care of them, I finally snapped. "Why did you do it?" I asked, my voice sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. "Why did you always put Ethan first? Why did you sell the house for him? Why did you give him everything and expect me to be okay with whatever was left?" My mother blinked at me, startled, as if she hadn't expected me to actually say it, as if she hadn't realized I had been carrying this question with me for my entire life. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, as if searching for the right words, as if trying to come up with an excuse that would make sense, as if there was anything she could say that would justify what they had done. And then, after a long pause, she broke down. Tears welled in her eyes, her hands shaking as she wiped at her face. And for the first time in my life, she looked truly, completely defeated. "We always thought you'd be fine on your own," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath, like she was finally admitting the truth she had been avoiding for decades. "You were always the independent one, the strong one, the one who didn't need us the way Ethan did. He was different. He always needed more help, always needed more support. And she choked on her words, taking a shaky breath before continuing. "We thought you didn't need us." I stared at her, my stomach twisting, my hands curling into fists, because of course that was their reasoning, of course that was how they had justified it to themselves. They had decided, long before I was old enough to even understand it, that I didn't need love, that I didn't need fairness, that I didn't need the same kind of care and attention that Ethan did. They had looked at me, their own son, and decided that I could handle being ignored. "You didn't think I needed you," I repeated, my voice cold, emotionless, because if I let myself feel anything in that moment, I was going to explode. "So that made it okay to push me aside?" That made it okay to act like I didn't matter? That made it okay to sell my childhood home without even telling me? That made it okay to take everything that should have been mine and give it to Ethan? She let out another shaky sob, shaking her head, but she didn't argue, didn't try to deny it, didn't try to convince me that I was wrong, because she knew I wasn't. And then my father, who had been silent this whole time, finally spoke. We thought Ethan would take care of us, he admitted, his voice gruff, edged with exhaustion, like he was finally too tired to keep up the lie. We thought if we gave him everything, if we made sure he was successful, if we set him up for the future, he would be the one to help us when we got older. We thought. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. We thought we were securing our future. I felt something snap inside me, something I didn't even realize I had been holding on to. They hadn't just chosen Ethan because they loved him more. They had chosen him because they saw him as their retirement plan. They had given him everything because they thought he would be the one to save them when they needed help. They had sacrificed me, not just because they didn't care, but because they had bet everything on Ethan taking care of them one day. And now they had nothing. Now, the son they had gambled everything on had walked away, and they were left with the son they had spent a lifetime discarding. I took a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm, forcing myself to keep my voice even, forcing myself not to let the sheer rage I was feeling take over. Do you regret it? I asked, staring at them both, watching as their expressions twisted with guilt, with shame, with the weight of the choices they had made. My mother nodded immediately, sniffling, her voice shaking as she whispered, "Yes. Yes, Jack, we regret everything. We should have treated you better. We should have." But before she could finish, my father let out a slow sigh, running a hand over his face, his next words cutting through the air like a blade. "We regret selling the house," he muttered, his voice hollow, heavy, but not with guilt over what they had done to me, just over what they had lost. If we still had it, we wouldn't be in this mess. I froze. For a second, I thought I had misheard him, thought maybe I was imagining things, thought maybe my own anger was twisting his words into something worse than they actually were. But then I looked at him, really looked at him, and I realized he meant it. He wasn't saying he regretted how they had treated me. He wasn't saying he regretted making me feel like I was never enough. He wasn't saying he regretted choosing Ethan over me at every possible opportunity. He was saying he regretted selling the house because now, without it, they were struggling. Not because of me. Not because of what it had meant to me. Not because they had taken away the one place that had ever felt like home, but because it had been their safety net. And now, without it, they had nothing. And that was all I needed to hear. Because no matter how much they cried, no matter how much they apologized, no matter how much my mother begged for forgiveness, they weren't sorry for what they had done to me. They were sorry that it had backfired. I had spent years waiting for this moment, spent years wondering what it would feel like to have my parents finally see the truth, finally realize what they had done, finally understand that they had thrown away the one person who could have actually helped them. But when the moment arrived, when my father admitted that the only thing he regretted was selling the house and not what they had done to me, I didn't feel victorious, didn't feel satisfied, didn't feel like I had won anything at all. Instead, all I felt was a cold, calculated sense of clarity. They were never going to change, never going to fully understand, never going to wake up one day and realize that they had truly, deeply, irreversibly failed me. And that was fine, because I didn't need their apologies. I just needed leverage. So, as my parents sat there in my tiny guest house, wallowing in their regret, not the regret of losing me, but the regret of losing the comfortable life they had once had, I decided to make them an offer they never expected. They could stay with me. They could have a roof over their heads. They could have food, water, shelter, basic survival. But there were going to be conditions. Strict conditions. Non-negotiable conditions. They had spent years making me feel like I was worth less than Ethan. They had spent years dismissing me, treating me like I was independent by necessity, assuming I didn't need them, assuming I didn't deserve the same care and love they had freely given him. And now, if they wanted anything from me, if they wanted me to step up and be the son they had never believed they needed, they were going to have to prove they were finally ready to put me first. So I laid it out for them, my voice calm, steady, almost clinical, as if I was negotiating a business deal instead of offering my own parents a place to live. "You can stay here," I said, watching as my mother's teary eyes widened, watching as my father let out a breath of relief, watching as, for a brief moment, they thought they had won. "But there are two conditions. The first is simple. You will admit, publicly, in writing, that you chose Ethan over me, that you sold the house for him, that you spent years prioritizing him, and that it was a mistake. My father stiffened immediately, and my mother blinked at me, her face falling, her lips parting in shock, as if she had never even considered that I would demand something like this, as if she had truly believed that a few tears and a little desperation would be enough to make me forget everything. And the second condition, I continued, my voice unwavering, is that you will sign over everything you have left to me. Your savings, your assets, your accounts, everything. If I'm the one taking care of you now, then I'm the one making the decisions. No more secret stashes for Ethan. No more hoping he'll come around. No more waiting for him to suddenly care about you. If I take you in, then I take over. Period. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, unbearable. My father clenched his jaw, his fists tightening against his knees, his face turning red with barely contained rage. My mother, on the other hand, looked like she had just been slapped, like the weight of finally being held accountable was too much for her to handle, like she was realizing, too late, that I wasn't playing by their rules anymore. And then, as if right on cue, my phone buzzed. I glanced down at the screen, and the name flashing across it made me laugh out loud. The timing so perfect, so predictable, so pathetically transparent that I almost couldn't believe it. Ethan. Of course. Of course, the moment he found out that Mom and Dad might have to give up whatever scraps of money they had left, he suddenly wanted to talk. I let the phone ring for a moment. Let my parents see the name on the screen. Let them sit there and stew in the irony of it all. The son they had chosen over me was only reaching out now, when there was something at stake. Then, with a smirk, I answered. Ethan, I said, my voice dripping with amusement. Wow, haven't heard from you in a while. What's the occasion? There was a brief hesitation on the other end, and I could practically hear him scrambling for the right words, trying to come up with an excuse, trying to pretend that this was just a casual, friendly conversation and not exactly what it was, a desperate attempt to stop me from taking control. Hey man, he said, his voice forced, strained, fake in a way that made my skin crawl. I just, heard Mom and Dad were staying with you. Thought I'd check in, see how they're doing. I almost laughed again. He wasn't even trying to be subtle. Did you? I asked, leaning back in my chair, keeping my tone light, unconcerned. Or did you hear that I'm making them sign over everything to me and decide that you suddenly cared? Another pause. A longer one this time. And then, just as I had expected, the mask slipped. Come on, Jack, he said, his voice taking on that whiny, entitled tone he always used when things weren't going his way. That's not fair. They're still our parents. You can't just take everything from them. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Something calm and completely indifferent to his pathetic little act. Oh, but they could take everything from me? I asked, my voice smooth, measured, full of something dangerously close to amusement. They could sell my childhood home, take my inheritance, give you everything they had, throw me aside like I was nothing. But now that the tables have turned, suddenly I'm the bad guy. Silence. And then, low and bitter, Ethan muttered, You're really gonna do this, huh? I grinned. Yeah, I said, my voice filled with absolute certainty. I really am. I hung up before he could say another word, before he could try to weasel his way into my plans, before he could try to convince our parents to hold on to the last scraps of power they had. Because now, they had a choice to make. They could finally, for the first time in their lives, choose me. Or they could hold on to their pride, onto their last, desperate hope that Ethan would come around, onto the delusion that he would magically become the son they had always believed he was. But either way, this time, I was the one calling the shots. I knew my parents better than they knew themselves, knew that no matter how much evidence was stacked against Ethan, no matter how many times he ignored them, abandoned them, used them, they would still hold on to some fragile, ridiculous hope that he would change. They had spent a lifetime making excuses for him, bending over backward to protect him from the consequences of his own actions, convincing themselves that if they just gave him enough money, enough support, enough time, he would eventually grow up, step up, become the son they had always imagined he would be. And even now, after everything, even after he had refused to help them when they needed him most, even after they had come crawling to me because they had no one else, they still weren't ready to let him go. I could see it in my mother's hesitant glances, in the way her hands trembled every time she thought about signing the paperwork that would put everything under my control. I could hear it in my father's gruff, uncertain tone, in the way he kept muttering under his breath about how they should give Ethan some more time. They still thought he might come around. They still thought he might save them. But what they didn't understand, what they had never understood, was that Ethan had never been their savior. Ethan had been their undoing. and he was about to prove it. It started with my mother pacing in the tiny guest house, her phone clutched in her hand, her eyes darting between me and my father, as if she was trying to work up the courage to say something she knew I wouldn't like. "Maybe we should talk to him first," she said finally, her voice soft, hesitant, scared. "Before we sign anything. Maybe he just needs—" I cut her off with a sharp laugh, shaking my head because of course, even after all this, even after everything he had put them through, even after he had abandoned them when they needed him the most, they still thought he might come back for them. "You think he's going to show up like some long-lost hero?" I asked, my voice cold, sharp, unforgiving. "You think he's going to sweep in at the last second and fix everything?" "Mom, he doesn't care about you. He doesn't care about Dad. He doesn't care about anything except himself." My father shifted in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest, his expression unreadable, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the tightness in his shoulders, the way he still wasn't ready to believe what was right in front of him. And then, as if right on cue, Ethan called. My mother gasped, staring down at her phone like it was some kind of miracle, like it was the sign she had been waiting for, like this was proof that Ethan wasn't as bad as I had made him out to be. But I knew better. I had spent years watching him manipulate them, years watching him string them along with just enough affection to keep them wrapped around his finger, years watching him take and take and take until there was nothing left. And now, with his last chance slipping away, with his parents, asterisk, his personal bank account, his safety net, asterisk, about to sign over everything they had to me, he had decided to do what he did best. Lie. I folded my arms, watching as my mother hesitated, her fingers shaking as she pressed the button to answer, her voice filled with something dangerously close to hope. "Ethan," she breathed, her eyes shining with emotion, as if she was a drowning woman who had just spotted a lifeboat. "Mom," Ethan said, his voice smooth, careful, calculated. "Don't sign anything. Please." And just like that, the room went ice cold. I saw it then, the exact moment my parents finally realized that Ethan wasn't calling to check on them, wasn't calling because he was worried, wasn't calling because he wanted to help. He was calling because he had something to lose, because he had finally figured out that if they signed everything over to me, he would never get another cent from them again. And for the first time, I saw true hesitation in my mother's eyes. She had spent her whole life believing that Ethan was good, that he loved them, that he would always be there for them. But now, she was seeing the truth. Now, she was hearing the desperation in his voice, hearing the way he wasn't even trying to pretend that he cared about their well-being, hearing the way he had gone straight into damage control mode, like this was nothing more than another financial transaction to him. "Ethan," she whispered, and I could hear it, the break in her voice, the quiet devastation of a mother who had just realized that her favorite son had never actually been hers. "We don't have a choice. We can't." "Don't be stupid, Mom." Ethan snapped, his patience cracking, his mask slipping, his true colors showing in one perfect moment. "Jack's just trying to screw me over. You really think he's doing this out of the kindness of his heart? He's punishing you. He's punishing me. You're just too blind to see it." And there it was, the last straw. I watched as my mother's face crumbled, as my father's fists clenched at his sides, as the realization finally hit them. Ethan didn't care about them. He never had. And now that they had nothing left to give, he wasn't even pretending anymore. My mother swallowed hard, her fingers trembling as she stared down at the phone, as if she was seeing Ethan for the first time, as if she had spent her whole life looking at a stranger and only now realized it. "We have to go," she whispered, her voice hollow, shaking, broken. And then, without another word, she hung up. The silence that followed was deafening. My parents looked at me, their eyes filled with something I had never seen before. Regret, real and raw and unbearable. And I knew, in that moment, that they had finally made their decision. They were choosing me, but it was too late. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating, filled with the kind of unspoken truths that had been ignored for years, truths that had been buried under layers of favoritism, denial, and selfishness. My parents sat across from me, their faces pale, their eyes red-rimmed, their entire world crashing down around them as they realized, too late, that everything they had believed in had been a lie. Ethan had abandoned them. He had made it clear that he wasn't coming back, that he had no use for them anymore, that now that they had nothing left to give, they were nothing to him. And for the first time in their lives, my parents finally understood what it meant to be unwanted. But understanding wasn't enough. Regret wasn't enough. Realizing they had wasted their entire lives worshiping a son who had never cared about them wasn't enough. Because after everything After the years of pushing me aside, after selling my childhood home for a wedding that ended in divorce, after all the times they told me I would understand one day why they had to put Ethan first, they were still expecting me to save them. They had chosen Ethan over me at every single turn. And now, when they had lost everything, when their golden child had thrown them away like an expired credit card, when their future had crumbled beneath their feet, they wanted me to clean up the mess. They wanted me to be their safety net. But I wasn't Ethan, and I wasn't going to spend my life fixing their mistakes. I exhaled slowly, watching them, letting the silence stretch between us, letting them sit in their own discomfort, letting them feel the weight of their own devastating choices. And then finally I spoke. "I've made my decision," I said, my voice calm, steady, final. My mother flinched, her hands clenching in her lap, her breath hitching, her entire body tensing, as if she already knew what I was going to say, but couldn't bring herself to accept it. My father's jaw tightened, his lips pressing into a thin line, his face hardening into something unreadable, something that looked suspiciously like anger, as if he still believed, deep down, that I owed them something, as if he still thought I should be grateful for the scraps they had given me while they handed Ethan everything. But I owed them nothing. Not anymore. Not ever. "I'm not taking you in," I said, and the words felt sharp and unforgiving and absolutely right. My mother gasped, her hands flying to her chest like I had physically struck her, her face crumbling, her entire body shaking as she let out a choked sob. "Jack, please," she whispered, her voice cracking, her eyes desperate, as if she thought begging might change my mind. We don't have anywhere else to go." I tilted my head, watching her, watching the way the realization of what she had done, of what she had lost, of what she had taken for granted, settled into her bones. "That's not my problem," I said simply, my voice devoid of sympathy, devoid of the warmth I knew she was hoping to find. She broke then, truly broke, sobbing into her hands, her shoulders shaking, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps, as if she had finally understood that she had made the wrong choice. But my father? He just stared at me, his face filled with a cold, bitter resentment, as if he was angry at me for doing exactly what they had done to me all these years. "You're punishing us," he said, his voice low, sharp, accusatory. "You think this makes you better than us?" I smiled then, shaking my head because of course he still didn't get it. "This isn't punishment," I said, my voice quiet even. "This is justice." Because the truth was, I wasn't hurting them out of revenge. I wasn't turning my back on them to be cruel. I wasn't doing this because I wanted them to suffer. I was doing this because they had made it clear for years that I didn't matter. And now, I was simply giving them exactly what they had given me. Nothing. No home. No support. No safety net. Just silence. Just absence. Just the empty, crushing realization that they had made their choice. And now, they had to live with it. My mother wiped at her face, her breathing uneven, her hands trembling, and when she looked up at me again, her eyes were filled with something that almost looked like acceptance. Almost. But my father? He just shook his head, his lips curling in disgust, his entire body stiff with resentment. And I knew, in that moment, that he would never understand, never admit to himself that this was his fault, never accept the reality of what he had done. And I was fine with that, because whether he accepted it or not didn't change the outcome. They were leaving. I stood up, exhaling slowly, letting the last remnants of guilt slide off my shoulders, letting the weight of their expectations disappear into nothing. "I'll give you a week," I said, glancing at the tiny, cramped guest house they had been so ungrateful for. "After that, you need to find somewhere else." My mother whimpered, nodding weakly, as if she had no fight left in her. My father just glared at me, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might crack. But it didn't matter anymore, because for the first time in my life, I was free. I had spent years carrying the weight of their rejection, spent years wondering if I would ever be good enough for them, spent years wishing they would see me, choose me, love me the way they had loved Ethan. But now I realized I didn't need their love, because sometimes justice isn't about what you take. It's about what you leave behind.